Hi everyone, Jake here from Fulfilled. Today I'm excited to be talking with Advanced CFRE, Alice Ferris. Alice has over 30 years fundraising experience and she is the founding partner of GoalBusters Consulting, which provides customized, practical, and hands-on services to small fundraising teams. Today we'll be diving into all of Alice's experience and knowledge, including professional development, how she began her career, and going into large gifts, and how you can serve on a board as an aspiring fundraising leader. Alice, welcome.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the invitation.
No, well, thank you so much for coming on. It sounds like it's quite a hectic week for you over there. So I really do appreciate it. But to get started, tell us about the beginning of your fundraising career and what were some key lessons you learnt in those early years working as an in-house fundraiser?
So I think it's appropriate that this week I'm doing an on-air fundraising campaign for KAWC, which is a public radio station in Yuma, Arizona in the US, because I got my start at Wisconsin Public Television as a volunteer doing fundraising for them. Although I wasn't really doing the direct line fundraising, I was helping out with the telefund essentially. I was on the phone bank, I was volunteering, and I was their youngest volunteer. So that was really interesting to kind of learn watching other people, watching all the grown-ups do the work, so to speak. And so when I got started as a fundraising professional, I started at Wisconsin Public Television. And the thing that I really appreciated about that job was that I was, in many respects, the utility person. I was the person who filled in all of the roles that just needed to be filled. It wasn't necessarily that I had the training to do it, because I certainly didn't have the training to do it, but they had confidence in my ability to just kind of improvise and learn new things and follow instructions when needed. And so I really appreciated starting my career being a generalist and being able to really learn about how public broadcasting did fundraising. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the early part of my career doing that.
Wow, what a great start. So when you look back at your career, what stands out as one of your most successful campaigns to be part of, and why was it successful?
Well, sometimes it's hard for me to think about what a successful campaign was, because in many respects in the fundraising field, we tend to, the longer you're in it, really think about things as a team effort. And that's part of my challenge, is that when you think about it as a globally team effort, it's really hard to pinpoint something of, oh yeah, that was my campaign and I did that really successfully. So with that as a caveat, I have been working for the last few years as counsel for Lowell Observatory, which is in Flagstaff, Arizona, and it's where they discovered Pluto. So some of us still consider Pluto a planet, so there. But Lowell Observatory has a very special place in my heart, because this is where I got my first development director position. So I left Wisconsin Public Television, where I was, again, the utility person, and I ended up moving to Flagstaff, Arizona, to become the director of development for Lowell Observatory in 1996. And so I was staff there for 4 years. And so it was a real privilege to come back as a consultant to help support the current capital campaign. And one of the things that we've done over the course of this campaign is that we've broken it up into chunks. And the current part of the campaign that we're working on is for the Astronomy Discovery Center, which is a $42 million campaign US. And when we first were in the first chunk of this, one of the things that we were working on as a team that I came to a little bit later on was the solicitation for the naming gift. So it is the largest gift for the campaign. And really what I did was help with coaching and help with messaging and help build the confidence of the solicitation team that was going to actually be in the room to ask for the gift. And we were all a little anxious about it, because what we were asking for from the donor was not only the largest gift that Lowell Observatory has ever received, but it's also the largest gift this family foundation has ever given. And it was a stretch. It was a stretch for this foundation to give this contribution. And so we talked it through. We talked over contingencies. We talked over strategies. And we felt like we were as prepared as we could be. And I felt kind of like a nervous mother, because I wasn't going to be in the room. I wasn't there to be able to help pivot or help manage the conversation. I had to rely on the fact that I had communicated as well as I could to the people who were going to be in that room to give them as much support as they could have. And so when they came back and said they didn't flinch, we all had a good day. And then when I get the phone call from the essentially vice president level position saying they just committed to the contribution, I felt so good. I really did. Even though I wasn't in the room and even though I didn't do the direct ask, I felt so much a part of that team. And so the Astronomy Discovery Center will be the Kemper and Ethel Marley Foundation Astronomy Discovery Center for a $14.5 million gift. It was really exciting.
Wow, that's incredible. And I know we always celebrate the successes in our career, but we also have to sort of celebrate the mistakes we make to learn from. So, what stands out as one of your most memorable mistakes that you've learned from?
So funny enough, it's also with Lowell Observatory, but not as a consultant. As I mentioned earlier, Lowell was my first director level position. And I went from being a member of a department of roughly 16 people to being a department of 1.5 people. And I was the one. And I had to make all sorts of decisions for that program that I never had to make before. It was one of those things that other people would make those decisions before. And now I realized, oh, wait, that falls on my plate now. And one of the things that I implemented at Lowell Observatory over my 4 years as staff there was that we got really aggressive with the direct mail. So we were doing a lot more mailing appeals to people. And I also went about a pretty aggressive acquisition program. So I was renting names, I was doing all these other things. And one of our board members suggested that I rent this one catalog list. And I got that catalog and it had telescopes in it. So I said, okay, that sounds great. So luckily I started with a small mailing. I started with a test mailing, a test list of about 3,000 names, which wasn't cheap, but it also didn't break the bank. And I sent out the letter like I normally would and waited for the responses to come back. And do you want to guess how many responses I got back?
I dare to say, but I'll let you answer that.
3. Out of 3,000 names, I got 3 responses to this mailing. And to make it even worse, 2 of those 3 responses were people who had folded up their resumes into my business reply envelope and mailed me their resume because they were looking for a job at Lowell Observatory. So I made a whopping $50 on this mailing that cost me, as you can imagine, far more than $50. And I thought, oh no, what have I done? And my boss, came into my office, is like, I don't know why you're spending all this money on mail. And so I had to do some analysis of what did I do wrong here? And that was the first time in my career that I learned how to read a data card. So if you've done any direct mail appeals before, your list will come with statistics. Your list will come with, here's the demographics of this list, here's the propensity to buy of this list. And I hadn't looked at that at all. I just saw, hey, they have telescopes in their catalog, so this must be an okay list. But at the time, the demographics of my donor at Lowell Observatory were male, 50 plus, highly educated, pretty high disposable income, and you kind of start to get a picture of what my donor looks like. The data card for this catalog list showed 20 to 30-year-old female, typically leaning towards being a stay-at-home mom, and not necessarily a higher educational attainment. And essentially what the data card described to me was the exact opposite of the donor that I currently had. And what that taught me, in spite of it being a dismal financial failure, was that like kind of begets like, that if I'm going to expand my donor list, I can't stray completely from what my current donor is, because there has to be some kind of commonality. And it also told me to prepare a little bit better and look at the details before I just kind of charge forward thinking this is a good idea.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that story. It sounds like a great lesson learned. Who knows? You could have got a high ROI possibly from one of the resumes that came in. So, but no. And as mentioned in the introduction, you've been doing this for over 30 years now, but it's only been since 2001 that you were a founding partner of GoalBusters Consulting. So, what made you transition into this?
Well, I had left my job at Lowell Observatory um, because I really made a poor decision. So at the time, I was pregnant with my son, and I had this grand plan, which I now realize was probably hormone induced, that I was going to be a stay-at-home mom until he went to school. And so I completely quit my job. And I told my parents this, and my mom immediately says, "Oh, this is a bad idea." I'm like, "Mom, you should be happy for me. You should be proud of me. I want to stay home and I want to invest in raising my child and all this other stuff." "You are so not suited for this. This is going to be a really bad idea." Well, I had my son. I left my job. 3 months into being a stay-at-home mom, I had that uneasy feeling that my mother was right. And I will say that hats off to every person who can be a stay-at-home parent, because it's so hard. It really is incredibly hard to give that much of your time and energy and all of yourself into parenting. And I couldn't do it. It was incredibly difficult to do. And I realized I have to do something different, because I'm not being a good mom for my son if I'm going to continue to go down this path. And so I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, which at the time had a population of about 55,000 people and not a whole lot of fundraising jobs. So as an alternative, I did what a lot of fundraisers do and just hung out a shingle of the Alice Ferris Consulting. And I thought I would just do it part-time until I found another job. And I started down this path. My first client was the Highland Center for Natural History, who was very forgiving, who allowed me to bring my child to almost all of our meetings. And in fact, I was still serving on a couple boards, nonprofit boards in town when my son was young. And one of the executive directors joked to me, he says, "You know what Matthew's first words are going to be? They're not going to be mama or dada. It's going to be so moved." So I ended up taking on a couple clients just on a part-time basis to see, okay, maybe I'll check this out. And I ended up really liking it, which is not to say that I didn't end up getting a couple more jobs along the way before I decided to take the consultancy full-time. But it was well suited for my mindset, because I'm a problem solver. And I loved having to go into an organization and try to figure out what was wrong, what was the root problem, and then find creative solutions to solve that problem within the confines of what they could do. Because I'm not one of those consultants that comes into an organization and says, "Okay, here's your magic bullet. Here's my formula. Here's your solution. Now take it and run with it." I'm more the person that says, "Okay, obviously you have a challenge, and I don't know what that challenge is because I don't sit in your shoes. I don't sit in your seat. So how can I creatively figure out, here's your root problem and here's a solution for it?" So I really like that part of consulting. But I still did it part-time, frankly, until 2007, because I didn't have enough self-confidence to be able to do this completely on my own full-time. I was terrified of, who's going to be the next client? How am I going to make a living doing this? I can't sustain this by myself. And strangely enough, it wasn't until I met my business partner, Jim Anderson, that I ended up gaining the confidence to take it full time, which seems counterintuitive, where you bring on another person and you now have to be responsible to generate revenue for two people, not just one person. But for some reason, doing that and having someone else as my accountability partner really forced my hand and forced me to say, either you're in or you're out. Either you're confident enough to do this full time or you're not. And he and I basically decided to start doing this full time in 2007. We jumped in with both feet, and we are, strangely enough, still partners and still doing it. And now we have a team of 10. So it's been pretty exciting.
Wow, congratulations. Hats off to you. And I think any fundraising managers going on maternity leave will have a bit of hope from listening to that, being able to take your child to meetings. That's incredible. Oh, that's amazing. And I guess something that you also said in that was that you sit down with the fundraising teams and listen to hear what the biggest problems and everything is before moving into the strategy part of what you do. So what are some of the biggest problems that you've seen when it comes to small fundraising teams executing their fundraising strategies?
That's a very good question, because I think often when you go into small organizations and small teams, they think that their first instinct almost always is, if we just had more money or if we just had more people, if we could just add to something, then we would have this problem solved. But in reality, throwing money at it or throwing people at it isn't always the solution. And I think in many respects, most of the organizations that I work with that seem to become successful, that seem to be able to pivot out of, sorry to use the word pivot, but to be able to move out of their problems and into kind of the next level or next phase of what they're doing as a fundraising team, is they have to have a growth mindset. And this is one of those books that I've been obsessed with over the last several years. It's called Mindset by Carol Dweck. She's a professor at Stanford University, and she wrote this book several years ago that talks about the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And someone with a fixed mindset thinks that you're kind of born with the skills that you have, and you're kind of born with the knowledge that you have. And at some point, you may outgrow it. And if it's something you don't know, you can't necessarily learn it. And we all have a mix of both fixed and growth mindsets in our lives. Sometimes we have a fixed mindset on one thing and then a growth mindset on another. Like, for instance, I have a fixed mindset about my hand-eye coordination. I'm just not good at sports. And just by the way I just said that, you know that I have a fixed mindset about it, where I said, I am not good at sports. As opposed to someone with a growth mindset about sports who might say, I'm not very skilled right now at tennis or something, where they've even put in their language that they have the ability to learn it and the ability to get better at it. I don't describe my sports skills that way. But that's one of those elements of a fundraising team that sometimes you can get into where I can tell that that team's not going to be able to grow. So for instance, I worked with a person that was relatively new to his position, and his job was pretty much the lead fundraiser for this small organization. And every time we gave him some coaching on a particular element of how to approach a donor, how to do donor research, how to prepare a proposal for a donor, he would say, oh, well, I've never done that before. Or, geez, I'm just not good at this. And he would constantly push back on the, I'm not good at this. And it took us quite a while to realize, wait a minute, it's not that he's saying he's struggling with it. He's saying, I have a mental block about this, and I don't think I can learn this at all. He ended up not working out in that position, and we ended up replacing him with someone who has a growth mindset for the same salary, probably the same number of years of experience. But this person took it and ran with it because he had a growth mindset saying, oh yeah, I can figure that out. Or, gee, I don't know that right now, but I can learn it. So looking at the team and trying to figure out, overall, does the team err towards a growth mindset? And if that's the case, then we potentially can provide suggestions, and we can provide coaching, and we can give people the tools to be able to learn what they need to do, to be able to be most efficient at what they're doing. If it's majority fixed mindset, then they're the ones who are looking for that secret formula. They're the ones who are looking for here's the magic bullet, and here's how we can move forward. And we're not necessarily the right consultant for them. I think connected to that for small teams, and this has to do, is loosely connected to the growth mindset piece. But productivity and time management is one of those things that I think is understudied in the charitable sector, because we all kind of get into it because we're passionate about some cause. We're passionate about something that we want to support. And we don't actually think about the logistics of how to do it. So productivity is one of those things where you focus on how to do it, and you focus how to do it the most effectively and the most efficiently while still having that human touch. And so when people try to just kind of brute force it and say, I'm just going to put more time into it, maybe they're not spending their time on the right things. So two of my areas of passion right now are that growth mindset piece and the personal productivity piece.
I think, yeah, there's a lot to take from that. And it's true, people get so stuck in their roles and their ways, and it's hard to break that barrier and go beyond that. And I guess when you've got your team of, individuals with a growth mindset, what are some important components when planning an individual giving strategy for the first time?
Well, in many respects, it comes down to basic marketing. And as much as we don't want to lump together fundraising and marketing as a whole, they are definitely different practices. There are many things that we can pull from the marketing field to be able to plan, particularly your first time campaign. And the number one thing that I think small practices and organizations throughout the charitable sector forget is that the first thing you need to do is identify why you exist. So a lot of people refer to Simon Sinek's Golden Circle TED Talk, and his book, Start With Why. And that's part of what you need to do. You need to start with why. Why are you as an organization in existence? And it's not to perpetuate your own existence. It's to solve some community problem, to make an impact on the world, to somehow make your corner of the world better. And if you start with that, and you know what that big why is, then you can identify what audiences are interested in that why. So step number one is understanding that mission and vision. And then step number two is understanding who cares about that, because not everybody will. One of my big pet peeves are people who say, and typically this is with charitable organizations, they will say, we need to get our message out there to the general public. Well, first of all, the general public doesn't exist. Everyone is a unique snowflake, and everyone has their audiences. In fact, another book that I'm obsessed with is Marketing Rebellion by Mark Schaefer. And in that book, he talks about islands. So people belong to multiple islands, but they have one primary island that they identify with. With that island identity, they're looking for other people who are of similar mind to join their island. And you, as a charitable organization, don't own the island. You're a visitor to the island. So how do you think about the audience and what they think and who they want to affiliate with and what difference they want to make in the world? Because that's defining their community. It's defining their island. And then, and only then, can you as a charitable organization talk about how you can connect the dots, how you can say, hey, you care about this, and we do something about that problem. So can we be welcomed onto your island? So this is a bit of a roundabout way to talk about a fundraising plan. But essentially what I encourage people to do when they're first developing an individual solicitation plan and appeal plan is that, first of all, come up with your why. Secondly, talk about your audiences. And then thirdly, don't try to tackle all of them at once. Pick one audience. Pick one that is going to be, in many respects, the low-hanging fruit. What audience is going to be the most responsive that you believe will be able to make you move forward with your financial goals more quickly than the other ones? So just focus on one. And this connects back to time management. Just focus on one audience And then based on that audience, develop the messaging and develop the tactics on how to appeal to that audience, very tightly focused on that one audience. Because you could decide, oh, we're going to do social media for our fundraising campaign, and then realize that your target audience doesn't exist on social media at all. I mean, then maybe you're going up the wrong tree, so to speak. So come up with the audience first, and then come up with the tactics to do it. And as much as there's a temptation of we have to apply this to all of the audiences, I really encourage people to focus first and then start to move out as you become successful, because it's, first of all, far more encouraging to be successful right off the bat than to try to hit everybody and not feel like you're successful. But the other thing is that it'll help with momentum. So you start with success, and then that momentum starts to carry over into your other audiences. But it also makes it a lot more manageable for small teams.
So once the why, the mission has been identified, where have you found fundraising teams need the most guidance when it actually comes to crafting impactful content for their direct mail?
Well, I think fundamentally there's one thing that people really struggle with, and it's not about you. That is the biggest problem, because every person who writes an appeal letter, myself included, the first time through, even sometimes years later, the first draft through is all about me. We need this other thing. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And there's not enough you in it. And, to quote my friend Tom Ahern, it's the you test, right? We have to run the Ahern test of the how many yous are you using as opposed to the I and we words. So Tom's guidance on this is that you should have twice as many you words as you have I or we words. And even I do this on a regular basis, where I will run my letters through that check, and I fail it on the first draft almost every time. So that's the biggest struggle I think nonprofits have, is that they're always focused on what we need. And of course, it's because you live that on a daily basis. You live budget shortfalls, you live staffing shortfalls, you live the struggle on a day-to-day basis. But when we're talking to donors, we have to remember who's receiving the letter, and we have to see it from their perspective as opposed to our perspective. So I think that's the number one thing that people struggle with.
Yeah, that's a very good lesson. And back to your previous answer as well, you talked about audience may not be existing on social media, so don't go using social media if your audience isn't there. But how should fundraising teams be approaching social media? How should they be using it to connect with donors in 2021?
So social media is an interesting animal, because one of the things that I have seen from the pandemic is that one of the, in many respects, casualties of the pandemic has been the casual social media user, because you are either all in or you're all out. We have become somewhat extremist on social media, because I've actually backed off on my own social media use because it's just so overwhelming. And with everything that's been going on this year, I've just taken a break for just a little bit. When you think about social media, generally, you think about it as a tool for stewardship and cultivation. Social media is not necessarily a good tool for ongoing solicitation. It typically will work for a one-off campaign. It'll work in times of crisis. It works very well with causes that are reliant on evoking some kind of anger feeling or rage feeling. So you'll get the tweet rage kind of donations, where people are suddenly, oh, I'm passionate about this because somebody said something I don't agree with on social media, so I'm going to make a donation. That's not sustainable. Rage donations are not a sustainable strategy. So when I tell nonprofits and charitable organizations to work with social media, our team tries to guide people to really making it more about developing the relationship. It's about developing the ongoing communication, and social media is far better at that than most of the other fundraising tools that we have at our disposal. So for instance, you may be able to engage with a donor on Facebook with your Facebook page, not with you as an individual user. Let me just say that as a caveat. And be able to feel like you're developing a relationship with this donor who you wouldn't necessarily otherwise have regular communications with. The other area that has boomed in the charitable sector in the US is the use of YouTube for fundraising. And it's not that they're doing solicitations for all that much on YouTube, but they're providing ongoing content for their donors that they wouldn't have done had there not been a global pandemic. The other thing that has become really prevalent is the use of live streaming. And so whether that's YouTube Live or Facebook Live or Instagram, you have an ability to have that conversational type interaction with a donor that you wouldn't have had under normal circumstances. So I think social media has become a really good tool for stewarding those of your donors who are on social media and cultivating that relationship on a more casual basis. And I also think has been really good at helping to cultivate those kind of entry-level and mid-level donors. This is not an area, however, where you're going to be able to secure some major donor off of social media. It's just, as much as people fantasize about, oh, I'm going to get $1 million donor on social media, it's not going to happen. I'd love for someone to prove me wrong. But really, it's about that kind of regular donor that you're developing that relationship with that you wouldn't necessarily go out of your way to do otherwise.
So another area that you help fundraising teams with is planning their major gift strategies. For organizations new to this area, how do you prepare them for their first major gifts program?
The most difficult thing about preparing an organization to go into major gifts is just, in many respects, getting over the fear of talking to people with capacity. And I think, especially in the charitable sector, we have so many people who don't feel that they are people of wealth and privilege that it becomes really difficult to put themselves in the framework of saying, oh, this is just a regular person. So typically, what I like to do with anyone who's going into major gifts for the first time is that I have kind of a group conversation. And this is far easier to facilitate now with the prevalence of Zoom and all of the other video conferencing tools. But facilitate a 3-way conversation between myself, the development person who's just starting out in this, and an actual major donor. And it doesn't have to be a major donor for their institution. In fact, more often than not, I try it to not be a major donor for their institution. I want it to be someone who can just talk about their philanthropy in kind of an exchange neutral environment. Because if this is not a donor for your organization, there's not this obligation to really hesitate on any questions or feel like you're going to impact future support if you say something wrong. And I think part of why I approach it this way is something that happened to me by accident. And this was I'm thinking it was 2003, because I was attending my first Association of Fundraising Professionals International Conference, and it was in Toronto. And I love Toronto, Canada, and I was there by myself. It was one of my early trips when Matthew was quite young, my son was quite young. And I was just exploring things on my own and not feeling obligated to network at every event and all this stuff. I was just having fun. And I went to this oyster bar where the world champion oyster shucker took on residence, apparently. And he owned this oyster bar. And so I'm just sitting at the oyster bar, enjoying oysters and chatting with the oyster shuckers. And a gentleman sits down next to me who is clearly recognized by everybody there and who is a regular. He has an order in front of him before he's even said anything really to the team. And for some reason, we started engaging in conversation. And it turns out that he was an incredibly large donor in the Toronto community. And he lived in the penthouse of the building that we were in the ground floor of for this oyster bar. And I was totally honest with him. I said, look, I'm here for a fundraising conference. In fact, there are close to 3,000 fundraisers in town right now. So first of all, just be on the lookout. But secondly, do you mind if I just ask you some questions? I never asked for his name. We never exchanged information, but I asked him about, why do you do this? Why do you do what you do? What motivates you to support these charities in such a generous way? And it was really eye-opening for me, and it changed the perspective that I had on how to deal with major gifts, because I got to hear it from his perspective. I got to hear it from how fulfilling it was for him, and how it was one of those things that he did that gave him meaning, and how it was one of the few things in his life that he didn't feel like was completely transactional. And that was just so interesting and helped me see things as, okay, the people who give significant amounts to charitable organizations are regular people who are looking for fulfillment as well. And that's why I try to, as much as possible, help someone who's just entering major gifts to talk to a real person who does this, so that they become human.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, it sure pays off to just start having a look around the city and get away from the networking space for a bit. That's absolutely incredible. And I guess the $1 million question is, once the strategy's in place, I mean, what are the next steps to ensure that a major gifts program is successful?
One of the things that I try to do with the steps that I put in place for major gift plans is that very often organizations will ask me for a 3 to 5 year plan. And I used to do those. And over time, I have decided that that's not our approach. I will do an up to 3-year strategy, but the plan, the actual tactical plan, I focus on only 1 year. And in that tactical plan for only 1 year, I actually divide up the plan into quarters. So each plan is actually 4 quarterly plans. Because I think if you try to go out too far, it becomes really hard to act on, because it seems like it's out there. Because we as human beings are incredibly good at procrastination. We will find all sorts of ways that we can procrastinate, and then we can change things, and we can say, oh, wait, I have plenty of time to do that. And this is actually the subject of a study that was quoted in a book called When by Daniel Pink, where he talks about this concept of periodization, where, for instance, if you do a New Year's resolution and you give yourselves 12 months to do things, you have this U-shaped curve as to how you do your work, where you have a spike of activity at the beginning. Oh yeah, I'm really motivated. I'm really going to do this. And then you have the February resolutionists who don't show up at the gym. So the gyms are packed in January. Well, they won't be in January 2021, but usually under normal circumstances, the gyms would be packed in January, and then nobody would be there in February. And when do people pick up those New Year's resolutions again? They typically pick them up in November and December, because it's oh, geez, I didn't work on that at all. I really should get back to this thing before we start another new year. So you have this peak of activity at the beginning, this peak of activity at the end, and then you have this big dip in the middle. And so what periodization says is that if you shorten the period and cram more of those periods into a set amount of time, you're actually more productive, because you have more of those spikes in activity. So with a major gifts initiative, what I try to do is break it down into usable bite-sized chunks. So I'm not going to tell someone, you need to make 100 calls this year. I'm going to say, you need to make 2 calls this week. That's it. Just call 2 people this week. And it doesn't have to be 2 solicitations. It has to be 2 contacts this week. And they have to be real contacts. It can't be like, oh, I left a message. No, you really need to talk to somebody. Or it could be, I sent an email to somebody this week and I actually had an exchange with them. That counts. That totally counts. It doesn't have to be an in-person. It doesn't have to be a Zoom. It doesn't have to be a phone call. It could be an email. It could be a letter. It could be any way that that donor prefers to communicate. So I try to break it down as much as I can into things that seem really doable for the person who actually has to act on it. The other thing that I build into the plans that I encourage everyone to do is to find an accountability partner that's not your boss. So do you have someone that you can connect with on a regular basis saying, I'm not making progress on fill in the blank, or I'm kind of at a standstill on a particular thing. Can you help me out? And in the cases where I've had people that I talk with on a weekly basis, sometimes we don't have anything to talk about. Sometimes we do. And often they'll get to the point where it's like, okay, so I just need to think this out loud. Can I just bounce this off of you for the next couple of minutes? And just having that person who understands what you're trying to do and understands the fundraising language to serve as an accountability partner and someone to just noodle things out with is incredibly helpful for making sure that the plan continues to move forward. Because I think what I've seen with major gifts people who struggle the most are the people who are lone gunmen, essentially, people who are that one person shop who don't have a network that they're willing to share with. It's not that they don't have a network, it's that they don't have a network that they trust enough to share with. They're the ones who struggle the most to keep the ball rolling, unless they're really, really, really self-motivated.
No, that's really good advice. And you also educate fundraising teams about the vast differences in cultures and generations and philanthropic communities. Explain why this is important to be aware of when it comes to fundraising.
Well, it kind of comes back to your audience, because in many respects, we all have this bias, this confirmation bias, to assume that other people think like us. And that can be really dangerous, particularly if you're dealing with another cultural sensitivity, if you're dealing with an age issue, if you're dealing with gender issues. Those can be challenging roadblocks that prevent us from really connecting with the other person. So one of the areas that we've explored a lot in the training that we've done is with generational issues and their motivations. So this really comes from my partner, Jim's bailiwick, because when he first joined me, he and I started working together in 2015. And one of the things that he brought to the table that just fascinated me as soon as he taught it to me was the Values and Lifestyle Segmentation System, or VALS. Now, this was originally created at the Stanford Research Institute. It's now a standalone organization based in California. And they do modeling primarily in North America, but they do have some models that are for Asia and Europe. And when they think about the modeling that they do, they're trying to identify what motivations drive people to make purchasing decisions. And since Jim came from this for-profit marketing and psychological profiling environment, when he entered the nonprofit sector, it became the how can we apply his knowledge to the nonprofit sector. So in the Values and Lifestyle Segmentation System, there are 3 primary motivations, and then there are subdivisions of each one of those motivations. I'm just going to touch on the 3 primary motivations to start. So there's the principle or ideals motivated person, there's the status or achievement oriented person, and then there's the action or emotion driven person. And again, there's different subtypes of these. Everyone is a combination of these things, but those are the primary areas that we think about and apply to the different generations, for instance. So the greatest generation, the World War II generation, is predominantly a generation that is very driven by principle or ideals. And the best way to describe someone who's principle or ideals motivated is that they will make decisions based on what is good or what is right. Now, compare them to the baby boom, which this is not just me saying it, this has actually been statistically surveyed, that the baby boom generation in the US tends to skew very heavily into achievement or status orientation. So they don't make decisions based on what is good or what is right. They make decisions based on what looks good or looks right. And that's not to say that they're vain, although some of them are. It's not to say that they're constantly making decisions based on how can they move up the ladder. But it means that they are very role conscious. So they may make different decisions if they're coming at it as a particular professional role, or they may make a different decision if they're coming at it from a family role or from a church role. So they're always conscious of the role that they're filling at that moment, and that's the kind of decision that they'll make. Now, contrast that to, I'm going to jump over the Gen Xers because that's me, and we always get jumped over, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. But the millennial generation, which is actually larger than the baby boom, which some people don't really get. It's like the millennials are actually the largest generation that are currently in existence in the world. The millennials, in spite of the fact that people thought they would grow out of it, tend to be also status and achievement oriented, but also action and emotion driven. So they're a combination of those two motivations where they will do things based on what feels good as well as what makes them look good. So emotion or feeling driven person is going to make a decision based on what feels good or what feels right. So when you look at those three areas, if you are a millennial fundraiser who's trying to talk to a greatest generation, World War II era, and you're using language that resonates with you, that's not going to resonate with the donor. So what we wanted to do was to give people, in many respects, shorthand to be able to think about how do you get inside of the brain of your donor so that you're not talking to them like they're a mirror, but you're talking at them with them like it's more a window.
We could have had a whole conversation just around that. That's yeah, it's very interesting. You've served on boards and you're the chair of the ACFRE credentialing board. How has your
actually a past chair?
past chair, sorry. How has your involvement serving on boards helped develop you as a fundraiser?
Oh, serving on boards has, as much as it can be an exercise in frustration, has really advanced my career far more quickly than I would have been able to do on my own. So when I first came to Flagstaff, Arizona, again, going from a department of 16 or 17 and coming to an organization where I was a department of 1.5, I was really overwhelmed. I wasn't used to being, frankly, that alone. And even the other half-time person, she was a full-time staff person, but I shared her with the executive director. And she and I didn't speak the same language at first about fundraising tactics and all those things. So I really felt lonely. And thank goodness I discovered the local chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, which was then the National Society of Fundraising Executives. And I found my people. I found people who could speak my language, who I didn't have to explain everything that I was doing, and really supported me. So I got involved as a board member in that chapter pretty much immediately. And because we were a small chapter, because we were a small board, I moved up the officer ranks really fast. So I had been at a director level job for only 4 years when I served as president of the AFP-Northern Arizona chapter for the first time. And that taught me so much about leadership, about governance, about dealing with people and interpersonal relationships and management and leadership. And all of my volunteer commitments have really been that way, where I've been able to practice many things that I read about when it comes to management and leadership that I wouldn't have been able to get if I just walked through the usual career ladder. Because even as a development director, at the time that I became a member of the board, the president of the board for the AFP Northern Arizona chapter, I was doing things for AFP that I didn't have responsibility for in my staff job. So dealing with the board, yes, I had to deal with it, but I didn't have to lead it. Dealing with other senior staff people, yeah, I had to deal with that, but I didn't have to be the person in charge. And so being able to explore those kinds of things and essentially have a safe space to make mistakes was really, really valuable for my career growth.
Great. And when you're seeing fundraising efforts thrive, what has been the role of the CEO and board in that success?
I'm going to start with the board as to how they can contribute to fundraising success. And it's not what's typically published in the textbooks, because I'm not of the mindset that every board member needs to ask for money. And it's partially because there's a lot of people who don't want to do it, and it shows, or they're frankly not good at it, and it shows. And I've seen more fundraising exchanges go off the rails because a well-intentioned volunteer board member does the exact opposite of what he or she should be doing. like talking someone out of a gift, essentially, because they're so afraid to ask for the gift. So I really think that people who like fundraising, who like asking for money, should be those people in that asking seat. And there's not a significant percentage of the people who are currently involved in the nonprofit sector. It's a relatively small percentage that actually want to be the person who said, would you consider a gift of? And that's okay, because those people who want to ask for that gift are frankly fearless, and they will take on as many of these as they can or want to. What is definitely the shortfall in the nonprofit sector are the people who are willing to do the cultivation and the stewardship piece, because they all think, ooh, I don't want to do fundraising because that involves asking my friends for money. Or worse yet, they'll say, oh, that involves hitting up my friends for money, which is like my least favorite phrase in the fundraising lexicon. What I want to encourage board members to do is to be that person who is essentially the matchmaker. Because when I think about how fundraising is done, it's really about that relationship development process. And in fact, the first way that I learned about how fundraising was done was from a senior seminar, a graduate seminar at the University of Wisconsin School of Business. And it was taught by the then Vice President of Advancement, Don Gray. And he put this chart up on the screen that says, here's how you do development. Any questions? And we're all like, oh, geez. And then he says, no, let me put it this way. Is anyone in the room dating? And he said, essentially, that's what you're doing. You are dating your donor. You have a pool of potential dates, and hopefully you have filters. You have morals. You have your type. So you winnow it down to the qualified prospects. These are the people who really do have a potential of supporting your cause. But you have to introduce yourself. You know, you can stare at that person all day long and you're not going to get the date unless you introduce yourself. And so what I want to see board members do is help with that introduction. You know, you really should meet so-and-so because you two would have a lot in common. You know, people love doing that, frankly. And if we can get board members to think about that, it's that you're just being the person who's doing the introduction. You're being the matchmaker saying, hey, you know, I'd like my friend to meet my other friend. It's all good. And then kind of coaching that relationship along. That's the cultivation process, and trying to help the people have a conversation to get to know each other. Because you don't want to be that bore at the cocktail party that only talks about themselves, right? You want to have a conversation. You want to have a two-way interaction. And board members can help with that as well. When you get to the asking for the date, it shouldn't be a group exercise in dating. And it really should be the people who are truly invested in it, in fundraising. So it can be a group exercise, but everyone who's in that room should be important to that exchange. You don't want to have people in there just for the sake of having them in there. And then you get into the stewardship phase, which is the showing up for the date. This is the telling the person that you did what you said you were going to do and helping them get more engaged in your cause. And board members can help there too, can help with, okay, here's how your money actually made a huge difference in this particular project. When it comes to executive directors, I really think that executive directors, CEOs, presidents, they need to be involved in all phases of fundraising, but they don't necessarily need to be the person who deals with all the logistics. I think where I've seen executive directors and CEOs thrive is when somebody is there, whether that is another staff person, whether that's a board member, whether it's a part-time person or a full-time person, someone is there to point them in the right direction and use them where it's most effective to use them. I want the executive director or the president or the CEO to talk to the people when it's critical that that person really have that connection. And so I want to see them involved in both the cultivation process of getting that relationship going. They should be involved in the solicitation process, but they don't necessarily have to be the one who asks for the gift. It's nice if they're comfortable for it, but they don't have to be that person. They just need to be involved in the process. And then they definitely need to be involved in that stewardship piece of showing up for the date, because they're the top dog. They're the ones who say, we said we were going to do this, and by golly, I'm going to make sure it happens.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And when you look back at your career of 30 plus years in fundraising, what stands out as your greatest achievement to date, and why is that?
You know, that's a tough one, because I think back to the point of I feel like fundraising is a team sport. And I find it very difficult to pinpoint a situation where it was me. It was about me. I've had moments where I felt really good about what I did, but ultimately it was still a team effort. And so, for instance, one of the areas where I've done a lot of work is in public media. Back to public media. We'll come full circle here. And when I got tapped to be one of the national talent for a little show that someone may have heard of called Downton Abbey, it was a huge, huge honor to be asked to be the on-air host for the fundraising specials for Downton Abbey. And Jim, my partner, likes to mention to people on a regular basis that I was the only person to be in all of those pledge specials for the original run of Downton Abbey on PBS in the US. And I felt really good. I felt a little bit like a diva on occasions, but it's still a team effort. It was me. It was my co-host. It was the producer. It was the person who wrote the scripts. It was the person who shot the camera. It was the person who did the tape. It's the person who did the edits. That was a whole team effort that made that all possible. And it was, frankly, the audience, because if the audience hadn't been there, then I would have been asking for money and no one would have been responding because the audience wouldn't have been there. So those are the kinds of things that could be pointed at as successes. But really, it's the much quieter moments that feel not necessarily like successes to me, but feel most important to me. And one of them in particular was a gentleman who actually saved my direct mail program at Lowell Observatory. Back to that. So this was after my dismal failure appeal. And part of that same appeal was a letter to a regular list that we did. It was Sky and Telescope magazine. So I did the test list and then I did my regular list. And thankfully my regular list produced like it normally did. It was just fine. And we acquired a new donor from one of those mailings by the name of Don Tronto. And he sent us $50. And we sent him a thank you letter. We sent him a new welcome kit saying, thank you so much for being a new donor to Lowell Observatory. And then a couple months later, he got a year-end appeal from us and he sent us $100. And at that point, I had a system in place where once you hit $100, you got another tier of thank you. So he got a handwritten postcard from one of my volunteers saying, thank you so much, and a phone message. And she was astute enough to say, his answering machine says it's the Toronto Observatory. What's that? And we looked it up and it turns out, I find out years later, it's a shed in his backyard, which is not a shed. It's a pretty full-blown astronomical observatory. But a couple months later, we send him another appeal and he sends a letter to my boss. And my boss always assumed that any letter was going to be a complaint. And he opens it up and he walks into my office and he puts it down on my desk and he says, can you explain this letter to me? And being the person that I am, I assume it's a complaint too. And I pick up the letter and it says, Dear Dr. Millis, I've been very pleased with the way Lowell Observatory has treated me over the last few months. And I was wondering if you accepted gifts of appreciated securities because I would like to start giving you $10,000 annually in appreciated securities. I looked him up. I said, we acquired him as a $50 donor from Sky and Telescope magazine. And Bob turned around and says, you can keep your mail. And that's not how the story ends, though, because he did end up visiting the observatory. He ended up being essentially my first major donor that I dealt with on a regular basis. He ended up being, the reason he had all the appreciated securities was that he was an early investor in Cisco Systems. And he continued to donate to the observatory past my tenure, past the director's tenure, into the current director's tenure, who was a friend of mine and a colleague of mine when I worked at Lowell Observatory. And he ended up having no heirs, and he left his entire estate to Lowell Observatory. And his last gift to the observatory before he passed away was a $100,000 gift to name probably the most beautiful new telescope on the Lowell Observatory campus. It's this totally cool kind of steampunk kind of telescope. It's gorgeous. And he passed away only a couple months after that telescope was installed. And he left close to a $3 million estate to the observatory. And the reason that his story always comes to mind is that I was at an advisory board meeting when I was coming back on as a consultant for the observatory. And he approached me and he said, "Alice, you may not remember me." And I said, "Don, I've been telling stories about you for years. And for that, I apologize because I haven't asked your permission." And he says, "Oh, no, it's fine." And he said, "I want to thank you." I said, "Why do you want to thank me?" He said, "Because if you had not sent me that first letter, I never would have discovered Lowell Observatory as a donor. I knew about it as an astronomer, but I never would have discovered it this way. And this has been one of the most fulfilling relationships of my life." And that, to me, is, it's not about whether I was a successful fundraiser. It's about the fact that he found that kind of relationship in his life and kept it with him until he died. And he is probably my favorite donor ever.
You're the perfect matchmaker. It's it sounds incredible. And what are you next striving for in your career?
I think, okay, so I turned 50 this year, and you're supposed to be reflective on those big birthdays. And I realized in typical type A Asian fashion, I was ahead of the curve. And I started obsessing about what am I going to do next a couple years ago as I saw this big birthday approaching. And I realized that I have been the recipient of so many mentors. I have been honored by their advice, by their personal investment in me, by their support. And I have tried to do that my entire career. I've really tried to consciously be a mentor and give back as much as I can. I think at one point in my career, I almost gave too much. I gave to a fault. And I've come to a place of balance of I can give of myself, but I know where to draw the line. And because I now have that better sense as to what my limitations are, as to how I can give back to the sector, it's not just willy-nilly anymore. I'm being far more strategic about the investments that I make in my volunteer service and in my mentoring. And I'm really trying hard to connect with people internationally, globally. And I'm trying hard to connect with people that wouldn't normally be kind of my usual suspects, the people that would normally be on my island. I guess in many respects, to go back to the island analogy, I'm moving to another island. And I'm really building on, especially the global piece. I love going to conferences that are outside of North America. And hopefully when we get back to that type of thing, I can do that again. I love learning more about strategies outside of the US, because there are so many things that, as much as we've taken US strategies and kind of exported them around the world, we have so many cultural modifications that have happened and cultural nuances that happen in other countries that are really exciting to me, of how can we take those strategies and move them back to the US and allow them to help communities of color, allow them to help rural communities, which we work a lot with. So I think for me, it's how can I be more outwardly focused and be strategic with how I invest in my personal professional development. Those are kind of my two big things. My parents would love for me to finally get a doctorate. That's not going to happen. Sorry.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's a pretty big commitment, but big expectations from your parents there. So we're down to the final question, and I just wanted to say thank you so much, Alice, for coming on for Phil today and sharing your knowledge and experience.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
So what's your final piece of advice to inspire and fulfill fundraisers to make a positive impact and create change for a better world?
I think sometimes we underestimate the power of one person, and we can get so overwhelmed, particularly in the fundraising sector where we feel like we give all the time. We give and we give, and we put in extra hours and we put in all this extra effort. And sometimes we wonder, am I making a difference at all? And I hope that people like me can find their one donor, find that one donor that you make a personal impact on, who you've connected to a cause that ends up being incredibly important to them. And again, don't underestimate how much of an impact one person can make. Because me doing a completely simple thing like connecting Don to Lowell Observatory ended up reaping benefits for the science and science education community for over a decade after. And that wasn't me. That was about Don. And I hope everyone finds their donor like Don.